And Lord, my hope and my request is that every one of us, if there's anything that we're holding on to in life, if there's anywhere where we're still grasping to for safety and security and strength other than you, may this be a time where we surrender that, where we finally set it down and give it up, and instead turn all of our hearts and our minds, our lives to you. May it be so. Amen. So we're in this series. The series is called Are You Here? And it's a two-part question that we've considered a number of times. Here's the first part of the question. When you show up here on a Sunday morning, when you walk into the Welcome Center and sit down in the Worship Center, are you actually here? And we ask that because we know, you can be physically present, but your heart and your mind can be somewhere far, far away. So my invitation to you is, are you here? Will you be all here, fully present right now? But the question comes with the second part, right? The second part is a question that everybody, every human at some point is going to ask of God. They're going to say, God, are you actually here? Because sometimes I don't see you, or I don't feel you, or I don't know if I believe you're here. God, are you actually here? And we've said that the place in life where we most ask this question is the place where you are most stuck. And so we've invited you to consider, where in your life are you stuck? And we've asked this question every week and time again. You might be thinking, Karl, seriously, all right, where are you stuck? I get it. You were stuck in the closet by your brother when you were a kid and you got your truck stuck in the mud. Okay, here's why I ask it every single week. Because here's what I know about myself, and I'm guessing that at least one of you, if not all of us, are the same. Wherever you're stuck, not just your truck stuck in the mud, but wherever you're stuck in life, that part of your life is precisely the area you are most likely to shove down or cover up or ignore or hide or pretend like it's not there. Wherever you're stuck is exactly the area where you most want to pretend like everything's fine. And so we have to ask ourselves every single week, because if we don't make it explicit and out front, we're just not going to bring that part of ourselves here. We're just not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. You're probably much better and smarter and holier than I am, but I think we all need the reminder. But here's the other thing I know about you. Even if I don't know you, I think I know this about you. And I hope this isn't presumptuous, but wherever you're stuck, here's what I know. Stuck is not where you want to stay. That's not your desired state. That's not what you're looking for. That's not what you're hoping for. Stuck, and we've said that stuck can be so many different things, right? We could be stuck in a toxic relationship that's just draining you and killing you. You can be stuck financially and you're digging yourself a hole, and even though the hole's getting financially deeper, you can't seem to put the shovel down. It's like, I can't put down the shovel. Or you could be stuck in a career that's it's just not where you need to be, but you don't know how to get into it. Or you could be stuck internally, right? You could have self-destructive thoughts that are just plaguing your mind every day. You could have self-destructive behaviors or addictions that are ruining your relationships and maybe in some serious ways ruining your life. And wherever you're stuck, I don't know where you're stuck, but you know where you're stuck. Wherever you're stuck is not where you want to stay. And there's two reasons that I know that stuck is not where you want to stay. Here's the first reason. We're reading the Exodus story. And the Exodus story is telling us about a God whose name we just learned in the story last week. He names himself as Yahweh. I am. I always have been, and I am, and I always will be. This is the one, the only, the eternal God. And in the story of the Exodus, where we come to today, is that God desperately wants his people to be free. I know that stuck is not where you want to stay, because I believe you were created by that God. And because you were created by that God, you were created not to be stuck in slavery, but you were created to find freedom. And I know that's what you want. That's what you desperately want. No matter what it is, that's what you want. And I know that for a second reason, because seeing that in the story of the Exodus is not the only place we see it, but actually over and over in Scripture, story after story after story, life after life after life, when God's presence is encountered in people's lives, people find freedom. And there was a guy, you've probably heard of him before. His name's Paul. Paul was stuck in his life, right after the time Jesus had come to earth, died, risen again. Paul was stuck, see, because Paul hated Jesus' followers. He hated them. He hated them so much. Do you know how much Paul hated them? He was murdering them and imprisoning them and doing everything he could to end this Jesus story that was spreading around. Paul was doing everything, and he was stuck fighting against God. But Paul had an encounter with God so profound that he went from being stuck fighting against God to finding the freedom of giving his entire life in service to God. And that guy, Paul, he was writing a letter. He wrote a lot of letters. He wrote a letter to a gathering of Jesus followers in Galatia, and here's what he wrote to the Galatians. He says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free." So I know that stuck is not where you want to stay, because I know that you were created by a God who desires freedom, and that God has already purchased your freedom by coming to earth in the person of Jesus Christ, and that happened so that you might have freedom. But here's the question that we're going to explore, that we're going to dig into deep today. And I'll just mention briefly, if you want to open your program notes, and if you like taking notes, that's great. There's 3 questions on the program notes. Where are you stuck? Where are you looking for freedom? And what is your choice? Now, sometimes, just allow me a moment of self-reflection. Sometimes I write a sermon, or preachers write a sermon, and it's like the sermon just sort of shows up, and you're like, oh, look, neat, there's a sermon, and it just happened, and that feels good. Sometimes there's a different process. And sometimes the notes on the back and the words on the slides and the words in my mouth, let me just say it this way. If ever you find yourself going, Karl, I don't know how these notes line up with what you're saying, let's just all be fine with that. Let's just all be totally okay with that. I mean, it might line up. We don't know. But if it doesn't, I'll just invite myself and us to be fine with that. So it's for freedom that Christ has set us free. And if that's true, then here's the question we're going to ask today. And I want you to really seriously ask this question. Here's the question. Where are you looking for freedom? And here's how we're going to explore that question. I'm going to briefly recap the Exodus story. And then I'm going to dig a little deeper into the confrontation between God and Pharaoh, where God demonstrates his power over the gods of Egypt and then accomplishes for God's people their freedom. And in that story, I'm going to invite us to consider that we might be stuck looking for freedom in all the wrong places, just like the Israelites were. But I want you to ponder up front, wherever you're stuck, whatever that is. I don't know what it is, but you know what it is. In that place, where are you actually looking? What are you looking for? Where are you putting your hope to actually find freedom? That's where we're going. I'm just going to ask, I feel a weightiness. So this is like the crux of the story, right? This is the Israelites get freed. I feel a pretty heavy weightiness about this, that I hope and I pray and I desire for God to do something big in our lives, in our community, but I can't do that. So are there a few people that would just pray for this message? Just kind of be, okay, good. I saw like 10 head nods. Man, what God did in the Exodus, I think he wants to do in every one of our lives. And I hope that's what happens. Here's the story. I'm just going to read the same scripture again. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, and he said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." So how did we get to this point in the story? Brief review. God's people, chosen by God, blessed by God, and things were going incredibly well. The promise of God was fulfilled amongst God's people, and then suddenly, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, we had the whiplash of going from promise fulfilled to blessing destroyed. And for 400 years, God's people were enslaved in Egypt. It was the worst imaginable place anybody could be. And God's people, trapped in slavery, cry out to their God, to Yahweh. And they say, "God, free us." And God hears their cry. And God calls a man named Moses, rescues him at his birth, prepares him in the land of Midian, and then meets with him face to face. And God says to Moses, "Moses, I've heard the cry of my people. And God says, I, the Lord God, am going to come down and free my people. And Moses gets excited. He's like, yeah, God's going to come and do something awesome. And maybe we've seen this, right? Maybe you've read scripture. Maybe you've seen the work of the church. Maybe you've been brokenhearted by something terrible in this world, and you have a sense God's going to do something. And you go, oh, that's so good. I love hearing when God's going to come down and do something. And then God looks at Moses and says, I'm going to come down and do something. Therefore, you, Moses, go confront Pharaoh. And Moses is like, wait, God, I thought you were the one who was going to come down and do something. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm ill-equipped. I don't speak very well. Pharaoh's never going to believe me. Plus, have you seen Pharaoh? Have you seen what he does? Have you seen his chariots? Like, I ain't walking into Pharaoh's courts. But God finally convinces Moses, no. I'm not calling you because you're equipped. I'm calling you because I will equip you. So Moses, hopefully like us, finally recognizes that it's not about us being confident in our ability, but rather it's about God. Moses goes and confronts Pharaoh. And that confrontation between God and Pharaoh shows up in what we read as the 10 plagues. 10 plagues which, as we learned last week, if you missed last week, or if you've ever struggled with the question, is God actually good? Please go back and listen to last week, because this is so important. But what appeared monstrous to us in these 10 plagues would have most likely appeared merciful to the first audience. They would not have seen a God who was a monster. They would have seen a God who presented a new kind of justice that was more equal and merciful than anything the world had ever seen. And finally, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's not just one guy, but he's a representation of the hard-heartedness of all of Egypt. So Pharaoh and all of Egypt finally acknowledges, I need to bow down and worship God. Now, as I was thinking through the Exodus story, there was an assumption that I had about the story that I didn't realize until just recently in life. And here's the assumption that I had. Maybe you had the same assumption, I don't know, but the assumption goes like this. So the Israelites, blessed by God, and then enslaved, and then 400 years go by, and during those 400 years, they're just stuck and nothing's happening until finally God hears their cry and comes and frees them. Here's what I filled that gap with, that 400-year gap. I assumed that God's people were stuck in slavery in Egypt, and that whole time, they know their own story. They're like, okay, well, we know that we're the ancestors of Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph. Read the book of Genesis for that. We know, or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then we know that Joseph came to Egypt, and yeah, my parents told me that story. So I assume that during those 400 years, all of the Israelites were worshiping Yahweh, or were at least considering themselves Yahweh worshipers. But there's a twist that comes later on in the story that has made me call that assumption into question. What were the Israelites actually doing during those 400 years? And to get to that, I want to tell you a little more about the gods of Egypt, because I know that you're sitting here going, yeah, but Karl, hold on a second. What about the gods of Egypt? Like, I don't know what the gods of Egypt were, and if I don't know, that's a big problem. So let me solve your problem for you. We learned last week that the idea that there was a single God who was over everything was potentially an unheard of idea at that time and in place. Rather, the standard was, maybe the only other option was that every nation has many, 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 many gods. And we know for a fact that Egypt was that way. Here is, for your enjoyment, a list of 11, but two of them are paired together because they kind of go together, 11 of the Egyptian gods. We know, I'm not going to read their names, doesn't matter what their names are, but we know from archaeology, from the hieroglyphics that the Egyptians wrote, from clay pots that we find, from all the things that archaeologists did, we know that the Egyptians had at least these 11 gods. Maybe many, many more than that, but these were probably 11 of kind of the main big ones that were clearly powerfully worshipped in Egypt. Now, here's the other thing we've learned about ancient polytheistic cultures. Polytheistic meaning many, belief in many gods. We know that each god actually only had dominion over one like area of life. This was the god of this thing, and then this was the god of this. So if I'm a farmer and I want my crops to go, I pray to the God who makes the crops grow. If I'm a herdsman and I want my sheep to not die of sickness, I pray to the God of sheep not dying of sickness. Like, there was just all that different stuff. So here's 11 Egyptian gods, and each of the gods had a different dominion. Hapi, the first god up there, that was the god of water. And if you live in Egypt, which is largely desert, water's a big deal. And the god Hapi, his dominion was particularly the Nile River, because the Nile River has a lot of water in it. Or the god Apis in the middle. That was the god over all animals. And Apis was often represented as a bull. Or one of the main Egyptian gods down towards the bottom, Amun-Ra. That was kind of the head Egyptian god. And that was the god of the sun, or of light. And we know that the Egyptians considered sun and light to be kind of the center of all power. Again, calling Amun-Ra the head god doesn't mean that that god was over everything. It more so means that all the gods who are kind of constantly fighting one another, like we learned last week, and violent and petty and warring, Amun-Ra is probably just the biggest or the most powerful, the one that all the other gods are scared of, or something like that. And then, of course, Pharaoh, at this point, Pharaoh has taken really a stroke of political brilliance, not in a healthy way, but in a power-hungry way. And Pharaoh has set himself up, not as simply a human king, but as one of the gods. And Pharaoh said, I am one of the gods, and I am actually the child of Amun-Ra, and therefore I am the one who provides life to all humans in Egypt. So that's just a few of the gods of Egypt. Now, we look at these gods, and we look at their realms, and then we pause and we remember, okay, so in the 10 plagues, in this confrontation between God and Pharaoh, we said that God was speaking the language of power, which was apparently the only language that Pharaoh understood, and God was speaking that language in the plagues to demonstrate God's greatness over against Pharaoh and over against all the gods of Egypt. Now, if we take the list of gods and their dominions they were powerful over, and then we put up the 10 plagues next to it, and what do we see? What was the first plague? God strikes the Nile River, turns it to blood. Archaeologists have found in some of the writings about the ancient god Hapi, the god of water in the Nile, Hapi actually had an enemy. And the enemy of Hapi was a bad god creature who was symbolized by the color red. And so God establishes himself as powerful against one of the Egyptian gods, or the gods Nut and Tefnut, which were the gods of sky and water, and those sort of went together, because if you live in Egypt and you want water, the Nile's really nice, but you also want water to come from the sky. And what's the plague that comes along? It's the plague of hail, coming down from the sky and demonstrating that, hey, you can pray to Nut and Tefnut all day long, but it is Yahweh, the one true God, who is actually powerful. And then, of course, if Amun-Ra is the chief, the head, the main of all the gods, and sun and light is the core of Egyptian religion, then the 9th plague, the plague of darkness. There could be no more powerful demonstration of the power of Yahweh over against the power of the gods of Egypt. And then finally, last but not least, if Pharaoh is God in a human form on earth and the provider of all life, then the last plague, which again looked monstrous to us but would have looked merciful to them, was the definitive example that actually Yahweh alone is the giver of life. And we saw with it not only that Yahweh alone is the giver of life, but he gives life and justice and mercy in a way that has never been seen before. Justice was always unequal. It was always retributive and escalating. And God demonstrates a justice that is truly equitable for all, that includes an aspect of mercy, which has probably never been seen enacted by a God before. Okay, so we met the Egyptian gods. And we see how Yahweh has stood up against all the gods of Egypt. And this is the point in the story where I think, okay, Pharaoh, people of Egypt, when is it going to sink in? When are you going to finally recognize? When are you going to acknowledge that you should serve Yahweh and you should stop serving these other gods? But then, I read something else from another book of the Bible that just opened my eyes to something incredible. So I have to pause here and just set the scene for a little bit. We're going to jump way ahead in the story. So here's where we're at. Slavery in Egypt, God comes down, frees his people, and then he frees his people from slavery, but he also says it's not just freedom from, it's freedom to somewhere, and God says, I'm going to give you a land. I'm promising that you get a land, because if you're a people without a land, you're not a people, you're just a group. So God says, I'm going to give you a land. Well, a lot of things happen. And finally, Moses, the leader of God's people, Moses has died and he's gone. And Moses has handed over leadership to the next leader, a guy named Joshua. If you want to read about Joshua, you can find it in a book in the Old Testament, conveniently named Joshua. And at the very end of the book of Joshua, Joshua is leading God's people. And they're literally standing and looking at the promised land. God's like, that land right there, like that one that you're looking at, I'm going to take you there. But just before they go in, Joshua gives a speech to the Israelites that it's incredible. Here's what Joshua says. He's talking to the Israelites who have been freed from slavery, who have been told they're going to get a promised land, who have made a covenant with God. We're going to get to all that later. And now we're going to go into the promised land. Here's what Joshua says. Now, fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And there's that line in the middle. The gods your ancestors worshipped in Egypt? Wait, hold on. So what you're saying is, for those 400 years, the Israelites were stuck in slavery. And it was miserable. It was terrible. We know that the pharaohs were treating them worse and worse, oppressing them, beating them, torturing them, sometimes murdering them. And during that time, the Israelites were looking for freedom by worshiping the gods of their slave drivers. They were looking to the source of their slavery to find freedom from their slavery. It's kind of unbelievable until we stop and ask ourselves, wherever I'm stuck in life, what are the gods that I'm serving in my life? What are the gods that you are serving in your life? Because here's one of the things that we see. We get the next slide question. What are the gods that you are serving in life? Because here's one of the things that we see. It appears to be that the story of the Israelites is actually a story about human nature. People who are stuck tend to look at the place they're stuck to find freedom. And even if year after year after year after year you stay stuck and you can't find freedom, and you're proving to yourself that where you're looking for freedom isn't working, even if you've proved to yourself so well, we have this terrible problem where we keep looking in the same wrong places to find the freedom that keeps not coming. And what it says to me is that the Israelites finally, after 400 years, Lord, grant us mercy that it doesn't take us 400 years to figure this out. After 400 years of looking to the gods of Egypt to give them freedom from slavery in Egypt, they finally realized that they had a choice to make. And the choice was, wait a minute. Maybe I need to choose to stop worshiping these gods and start worshiping something else. And what it says to me is that freedom always begins with a choice. Making this choice doesn't magically make everything right in the next instant, but I believe it's a choice that is an essential beginning, a choice that if we don't make it, if we don't make this choice, we are immediately and permanently hamstringing ourselves from ever finding the freedom we desire. And so in just a bit, I'm going to ask you, what's your choice? Because here's what I know about us. Just like the Egyptians had some gods that the Israelites were worshiping and the Egyptians were worshiping, we live in a world full of gods that we are tempted every day to worship. Let me tell you about a few of the gods that I think we worship. I didn't have a slide, but this is where you can fill in the blanks. We live in a world that loves to worship the God of power, right? If you're stuck in your career path, or if you're stuck in some sort of sense of where you're going in life, the answer the world gives you is power up. Power up and demonstrate that you're bigger and stronger and you can push people around better than anybody else. And if you worship the God of power, you'll find whatever you need in life, because we live in a world that worships the God of power. Another God our world worships is the God of sex. We live in a world saturated by sexual imagery and by the promise. It's a false promise, but it's a promise the false gods of this world make to us. The promise that if you get enough sex or good enough sex with the right people or with enough people, then you're going to find whatever your heart's desire. The answer to all that you're lacking in life is just getting more and more sex. And if hey, sex isn't good in your marriage, or if it's not good, then the problem is just get rid of that and go find more of this. Or maybe the promise of sex obviously shows up as well in pornography. You know, pornography's been around forever. We have all sorts of ancient evidence of pornography in ancient cultures, but the difference is now we live in a world where you don't have to work for it anymore. It's just available to anyone and everyone all the time, and it's addictive, and it enslaves people, and sex has been set up as a false god. Third one, we worship the god of money in our world. We hear the message over and over and over that if you get enough money, if you gather enough resources, if you have enough investments, if your nest egg is big enough, if your income is large enough, then all of your problems can be bought away. You can purchase your problems away. But the thing that we learn about money is money's actually a really, really, really good servant. It's incredible because you know what money does? It does whatever you tell it to do. Money never does anything of its own accord. It will only do exactly what you tell it to do. Money's an incredible servant, and God actually wants us to be blessed with money, to have money, to use it for good, godly purposes. But the thing is, money's a great servant. It's a terrible master. Just terrible. Because the moment you let it become your master, then you don't get money to use for your purposes, but rather money gets you and bends all of you to its perverted purposes. We live in a world that worships at the altars of sex and money and power. If you want to read more about that, Tim Keller wrote a phenomenal book, Counterfeit Gods. Go check it out if you're struggling with any of those. There's one more God that I want to consider that we might be struggling with. That like the Egyptians, we might be looking, or like the Israelites in Egypt, we might be looking to this false god to find freedom. And we're just not going to find it there. See, because we live in a very individualistic world. And the message of the individualistic world is the solution to all of your problems can be found entirely in you. You have what it takes. You've got everything you need. Okay, this next part's just a little hard. So I don't want to beat up on you or on me, but here's the thing. If you're to think about all of the problems in your life, maybe they're circumstantial problems and you feel stuck because you're just trapped under these circumstances. Maybe they're thoughts or behaviors or addictions you've got. Maybe they're bad decisions that you seem to keep making. If you think about all the ways you're stuck in your life, there's one common denominator to every single one of them. And do you know what that common denominator is? It's you. You are present for every bad decision you make. You are present for every destructive, self-destructive thought that you have. Which I don't want that to like blame you or shame you, but what I do want it to say is too often, and I put this in the notes, it's not on the screen, too often you look to you to solve your problems. And if you are at the core of all the problems, I think we just kind of have to confess that maybe you are not the answer to your problems. Because we live in a world that encourages you to worship at the altar of your own self-importance. And I just don't think that's ever going to get you freedom. So, I think, here's what I think. If we're honest with ourselves, I think that wherever we're stuck, if we've been stuck for a long time, if wherever you're stuck, if you can be honest enough with yourself and dig deep enough, and this is hard work, you're going to find that somewhere in there, again, I don't want this to be shame. I don't want this to be guilt. I've seen this pattern played out in too many people's lives. I'm going to share a couple stories in just a bit about some people who have shared with me in the past couple weeks about this. I've seen this story played out in too many lives where we keep looking to the wrong place to find freedom, and the choice is simple. Are you going to keep looking in all the wrong places? Or are you going to finally acknowledge that those false gods will never get you what you need, and instead start looking at the only place that you can truly find freedom? Here's what Paul said to finish that verse we read earlier. He said, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free." And then get this, he gives an instruction, an imperative, it's a command. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Because here's what we see, right? You know, maybe you've never made this decision. Maybe you've never made a critical decision to your life to say, you know what, I've been looking here and here and here, and it's not getting me anywhere, so I'm going to stop, and I'm going to start looking to the God of the Exodus. And not only to the God of the Exodus, but we know that was just the beginning, to the completion of that God's work, God himself in the person of Jesus coming to earth to purchase freedom for all people. Maybe you've never made the decision, I'm going to stop looking here and I'm going to start looking here. So I hope that today's the day you make that decision for the first time. But maybe you've made that decision before. And if you're like me, then you might recognize you make the decision, you're like, yes, I'm going to surrender all. I'm going to give my life to Christ. I'm going to follow Christ. But oh, look at that. That's really shiny. That's really neat. Oh, maybe I'm going, oh, shoot. No. Okay, I'm looking to Christ. I'm looking at, what was that? What are you? And we keep struggling. The word stand firm, it's like just like our body and our heart and our broken desires. No, but I got to stand firm and choose to continue to look to Christ. We've made this invitation a bunch of times. We said, wherever your journey is, whatever you're struggling with, whatever God's doing in your life, let's try to be honest about that and share that and be a little transparent about that. And dozens of you have done that on our prayer posters on the walls. When we go to communion in just a minute, I'd invite you to consider, if you haven't written your prayers, your struggles, your hopes on the prayer posters, if you feel like it's, like you can share an appropriate amount, I'd encourage you to consider that. Dozens more of you have written things that you didn't want to put publicly on the poster, so you wrote on the prayer cards on the back tables or out in the welcome center. And we as a staff have been praying for you week after week after week. A few of you have shared some stories, and I want to just give you a little glimpse right now. Some of the things that God is doing right here in our midst, and I hope that these little glimpses might give you even more hope to make a choice in your life. Crystal Boland. Many of you might know Crystal Boland. She's been around for a long time. And Crystal shared this story with me, so I share it with her permission. She was raised in a home. Her mom had a diagnosed mental illness. And in that situation, in Crystal's childhood and upbringing, she suffered quite a bit in her home. And so when she became an adult and started to recognize all the pain that she had suffered as a child, she then had to start asking herself, how am I going to find healing from all this pain that I've suffered? And what she believed, and she told me for decades really, what she believed was, I've been wounded by my mom and I'm suffering from my mom. Therefore, here's the solution. Here's what's going to happen. Here's where I'm going to find freedom. I'm going to go and fix my mom. And if I can just fix my mom, which obviously I could do, then all of my pain will be wiped away. Well, you know what happened for decades? She kept trying to fix her mom. And she kept getting hurt again by her mom. She kept getting frustrated and beating herself up because it turns out not only can she not fix her mom, but none of us can fix anybody. We actually can't even fix ourselves. And it's just recently that it finally dawned on Crystal, and it didn't just dawn on her, but she said, she thinks the voice of God has been speaking to her for years and years, but she finally listened and heard God say, Crystal, it's not your job to fix your mom. It's my job. God is the only one. And Crystal said, the moment she acknowledged that, the very next thing she heard was, and you know what, Crystal? You can love your mom. You can care for your mom. You can stop by and talk to your mom and be interested in your mom, but leave fixing her up to me. And you know what happened? Suddenly, Crystal was able to be with her mom and enjoy it. And the relationship is getting better because finally Crystal said, wait a minute. I can't solve the problems and the wounds that I have. I need to give that all up. I was talking to another friend, Lisa Mall, Ron Mall's wife, Lisa. She is our advocate for our advocacy for victims of abuse ministry. The Covenant has a phenomenal ministry that primarily is a support for primarily women, some men, but primarily women who are victims of or survivors of domestic violence and domestic abuse. And Lisa just last weekend was connected to a group of about 40 women from around the country who are domestic violence survivors. And these women came together, and for many of them, it was the first time in their lives when they were able to stand up in a room and share their whole story. Share everything they've suffered. And maybe they'd shared bits and pieces of it, but what happened in that room was they shared their story and they were believed, because so often victims are not believed. They were validated as being people who are valued and loved and cherished. They were listened to and respected. And Lisa shared how, these were women from all around the country that happened to gather here, but she shared how one of the themes that came up in story after story after story, and I don't think this is I don't want to fault the victims. You never fault the victims. But one of the lies that they believe is if I'm suffering from abuse at the hands of my husband, then what I need to do is I need to serve my husband better, or I need to love my husband better, or I need to respect my husband better. And just like the Israelites in Egypt, they think maybe the solution to this suffering is found at the very hand that's hurting me. And so Lisa got to be part of the group that said, no. What you need to do is get out. Which, if I can, just for a minute, if you know anybody, if you ever hear of somebody, if you ever come across somebody who's suffering domestic violence, please call Lisa or call the office, because we want to help them get out. And I especially want to say that because a second theme, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's just so important. It's not a tangent. This is one of the things that also came out in so many of these women's stories is that when they went to their pastors, they went to their churches, they were told, oh no, you're the wife. You need to submit to your husband and do whatever he says. And that has got to stop. We need to end that message. And we need to say, no. The God that we serve is the God of the Exodus who stood up against injustice and said, no, let my people go and I will get you out of here. So please, if you hear about it, if you see, if you know anybody, if you ever get a whiff of domestic violence, please talk to somebody, talk to Lisa. Let's be a church that changes that script. But this comes back now to me and you. Those are just two stories. I don't know what your story is. I don't know what your struggle is, but here's what I do know. We as people so often look in all the wrong places and we try to find freedom exactly where it can never be found. So here's my invitation to you. Would you today finally acknowledge where you're looking and make the choice to stop looking there and start looking in the only place where true freedom can ever be found, and that is in Jesus Christ, the power of whose Spirit is here and present and can set you free. Because see, the Exodus story, like we've said, the Exodus story is all just the beginning. And one of the beautiful images of the Exodus story is that at the moment of the Exodus, God said to his people, I'm going to come down and my Spirit will be powerfully present. But here's what you need to do to be saved. You need to take a young spotless lamb and you need to kill it. And you need to take the blood of that lamb and you need to paint it on the doorposts of your house. And if every house takes one young lamb and paints its blood on the doorposts, then that house will be saved. But when Jesus came, when Jesus died on the cross, when Jesus' followers gave up hope for 3 days and thought this is just another false Messiah that we'll forget about, but then 3 days later, when he came back to life which is the only explanation for all of the ways that all of his followers risked so much to pass this story on generation after generation after generation. When he came back, Jesus said, I am now the one and only Lamb whose blood is sufficient, not just for these people at this time, but for all people at all time. But here's the choice you have to make. Jesus isn't going to force you to follow him. He's not going to force you to look to him. He's only going to offer you a simple choice. Will you bow down and worship him alone? I want to leave you with one closing image, and then what we're going to do is sing a refrain of I Surrender All. And during that, I'd invite you to consider, what are you holding on to that you need to finally surrender to God? But here's the image that I see that we're fighting against. I don't watch boxing or like mixed martial arts or like ultimate fighting. I don't really watch that, but I've seen it, and so, I've seen some movies. And if you watch a boxing movie, it doesn't matter what the boxing movie is. But here's the storyline: we meet hero boxer, right? There's a boxer and they're a hero, and we get really excited because the hero, the boxer, is going to get into a big fight. And apparently it's really exciting that they're going to get into a big fight because our entertainment culture is messed up. And then the big fight comes, and the hero is in the fight and is just getting pummeled. And then their eye is puffy and their lip is bleeding. And there comes this point in the big fight where our hero is like, staggering, and they can barely stand up. And we're like, oh no, the hero's not gonna win the fight. But we know that they're gonna win the fight because it's a movie, and the movie wouldn't sell tickets if they lost the fight, right? So the hero's struggling, but then the music changes, and it starts to crescendo a little bit. And we're like, oh, something's gonna happen because the music changed. And then the boxer is like just about to fall down, but then they stop. And as the music crescendos, they stand up a little more. And then they take like a bad swing once, and we're like, oh no, you can't take a bad swing. But then they pick their hands up, and suddenly they get a good jab, and suddenly they get two, and then suddenly the boxer beats their opponent. We're like, ah! I think it's a terrible storyline. Because the lie it tells us is that no matter where you're stuck, when you're just about to fall down, you know what you need? You just need to be stronger. And I don't think that's the answer. So here's my question. Worship team, you guys can come on up. Here's my question. If you're like that boxer and you're about to fall down, will you just let yourself fall and give up on the idea that you need to be strong enough? Pray with me. God, I ask that this truth, not truth because I'm saying it or because it makes sense at all, but this truth because you've shown it to your people time and time again, may this truth that, God, we don't need to be strong enough, we need to give up. And we need to give up by surrendering all that we are into your hands. Help that truth sink in. And then, God, I pray that right now as we sing this refrain, that we might finally let go of all the wrong places we're looking for freedom and finally look to you and only you, the source of our life. Amen.